bachelor's degree was actually in English, and I'm currently doing freelance editing for science and working into a medical writing capacity. So, sorry. Goals today, first, we're just going to review some of basic principles of composition and style. This is true for basic writing and science writing. Towards the end, I'm going to look at components of the abstract. It's quite formulaic, and so we're just going to review what makes up a solid abstract, and then leave time for questions. So my goal with this presentation is to give you a chance to consider some of these concepts, and then at the end, what I would really love is feedback from all of you on what you need to feel confident moving forward. And we can kind of discuss the possibility of, as a team and as a group, workshopping some things that you guys have written and trying to tighten the writing and improve the clarity. Okay, so I'm not reinventing the wheel on this. Many of the points that I'm going to be making today are derived from E.B. White. So this is E.B. White and his dog. E.B. White was a pretty famous American journalist and writer, and with one of his mentors, William Strunk, he wrote this book that is a classic. It's called The Elements of Style. This is not directed towards scientists, but most of what's included in this book is very, very relevant for scientists and anybody who has to write anything. This book has been around, I think it's decades, and you can find it for free online. This is the link for that, and I'll make sure that everything is posted when I'm done speaking so that you're able to access that. Okay, so first principle that I want to talk about is writing in a way that comes naturally to you. Finding your own voice as a writer. So there was an exercise that this guy, Erasmus, he was 15th, 16th century philosopher. He would have his students take a sentence in Latin, and then as a way of finding their own voice and understanding the flexibility of language, he would have them translate it in as many different ways as possible. This sentence in Latin could be translated as, "Your letter has delighted me very much." Erasmus came up with 150 different ways to say this, some of which included, "Your epistle has cheered me greatly. Your note has been the occasion of unusual pleasure for me. When your letter came, I was seized with an extraordinary pleasure." The point here isn't that all of these sentences are great. Some of them are clunkers. Some of them have a different tone to them. The point that he was trying to illustrate is that language is flexible, and that you need to find the way that you string words together that sounds like you. I think that something that can be a struggle in writing science is, again, finding a way that sounds like the way that you speak, even. And I would argue that if you're trying to write something and you're struggling to find your own voice, you're struggling to find your own words, that's a pretty clear sign that you may need to go back and do a bit more research. Typically, when we have to write about things that we're less fluent in, that we know less well, it can be more difficult to come up with your own words. And so if you find yourself struggling to write in your own voice, one, ask yourself, do I need to do more research on this topic? No unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all sentences short or avoid all detail and treat subjects state who use the term "at this juncture of maturization" to mean now. There are way too many words in this, and it's not direct. And I think that often indirect language can be used to conceal, and as scientists, we do not want to do that. This was an article that came out a few years ago, kind of highlighting why being clear and direct in science is such a good thing. So they analyzed publications that had been found to have fraudulent data in them. And what they found is that papers that were fraudulent had much higher proportion of what they call linguistic obfuscation. So lower readability, higher rates of jargon. And so again, as scientists, as writers of science, we want to make sure that we're using language that is clear. Okay, so just a few examples of what we mean by direct language. So for instance, a period of unfavorable weather set in, and all this means is it rained every day for a week. So here, unfavorable weather, say specifically what you mean. In this case, we mean rained. And set in, this is also an indeterminate length of time. You can fix this by being very direct, that we mean for a week. Another example, he showed satisfaction as he took possession of his well-earned reward. That can become more simply, he grinned as he pocketed the coin. Grinned is a much more readily visualizable action than showing satisfaction. So again, it's direct. These are several words that I think as scientists, I have seen this in science writing, I've seen this in just regular writing. So beware fancy words is what E.B. White said. This is from William Zinsser. He's another great writer on writing. There's no reason to use a longer word or a fancy word when a shorter one will suffice. So for instance, assistance, you can say help. Numerous, you mean many. Facilitate means ease. Remainder, rest. Initial, first. Implement, do. Sufficient, enough. Attempt, try. Referred to as, called. Time and time again, try and think, how can I make this more simple? How can I just strip everything down to its bare components? So use the active voice when appropriate. We can talk about this more if that's something that people would like to do. So I think on the left, you're going to see examples of passive voice, and on the right, active voice. So this first example, my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me. This is on contrast to active voice. I shall always remember my first visit to Boston. One way to tell the difference between this is you have here, I, the subject, the person doing the action is right there at the very beginning of the sentence. And in passive voice, me is at the end of the sentence. That's not always going to be the case, but in many instances it will be. Here's an example from science. Centrifugation of the sample was performed by the scientist, passive voice, versus the scientist centrifuged the sample. So I wrote when appropriate because I think in methods sections, sometimes the passive voice is actually called for. It can get really weird if you have a paper that says, you know, we did a Western blot, we did this. So use best judgment. In general, in introductions, writing of results, and in discussions, active voice is to be favored. This is another principle, and that is group-related words. This one is important because it can help you to avoid some just common grammatical errors. So to take the first example, he noticed a large stain in the rug that was right in the center. This particular example is vague. So what we don't know is the stain in the center of the rug? Is the stain not in the, is the rug in the center of the room? It's really unclear from this sentence what is where. So we can change that by making sure that related words are grouped. For instance, he noticed a large stain right in the center of the rug. Second example, Toni Morrison in Beloved writes about characters who have escaped from slavery but are haunted by its heritage. So in this case, instead of splitting up the subject from the rest of the sentence, we can just move this little clause. So in Beloved, Toni Morrison writes about characters who have escaped from slavery but are haunted by its heritage. Here, all of the related words are linked together. And then finally, A dog, if you fail to discipline him, becomes a household pest. This can be transformed into, unless disciplined, a dog becomes a household pest. So just to summarize some of the, I think, most important and in order of importance, principles of composition. So one is find your own voice, write in a way that feels natural to you. Two is cut the clutter whenever you possibly can. Three is to be direct, use direct, definite, specific language. Four, use active voice, again, when appropriate. And five is to group related words to try and avoid just some common grammatical errors. Okay, so in this next bit, I just want to go through components of an abstract of what can we expect to see in an abstract. So this is from Nature. They actually have specifications on what do we need to do to construct a well-written abstract. And they call this first sentence one or two sentences providing a basic introduction to the field, comprehensible to a science in any discipline. So in this example, we have during cell division, mitotic spindles are assembled by microtubule-based motor proteins. I would say that this is what I would just call the who cares. So when writing anything, I think it's always a fantastic idea to take a few steps back, to zoom out just a bit and ask yourself, who cares about what I am writing? What is the reason why I am writing this? What is my justification, my rationale for doing this? In the next bit, you have, this is what Nature calls 2 to 3 sentences of more detailed background, comprehensible to scientists in related disciplines. So I would, I call this the knowns. After you've said, who cares about this? You've written a sentence or two justifying what you're about to say. You then need to remind the reader of what is already known in the field. And I'm not going to read that. I'll throw all of this up at the end so that you can go through that if you like. After you've gone through the who cares and the knowns, the next piece in this very, very formulaic abstract is the key question. And so I think, you know, this is obviously for a research article. Many of these apply to reviews as well. In particular, when starting a review, it's essential that you have to justify, why are you writing a review? Who cares about it? Why should I, as a reader, bother to read what you've written? And then the knowns, obviously, that's probably the biggest part of a review, is you're doing a lit review and summary for your reader. Research article, we have this key question. So they say, stating the general problem being addressed by this particular study. So in this case, it is the precise roles of kinesin 5 during this process are unknown. You can rephrase that as a question, and that really gets to the heart of why these authors decided to pursue this research project. Directly beneath that, we have a key finding. So this summarizes the main results. Here we show that the vertebrate kinesin 5, HT5, drives the sliding microtubules depending on their relative orientation. Also illustrates, this is a nice sentence, it's active voice. Here we show something, and they are using really direct, clear language choice to state what they found. They then follow this up with some of the maybe secondary findings. This is probably optional of whether you want to reveal in direct comparison to what was thought to be the case previously. Right, so how the main result adds to previous knowledge. So they're just expanding on what their key finding was. And then finally, a conclusion. So this is just taking all of the findings and then stating them into a general context, orienting them into the body of knowledge that's already established. So again, components of the abstract in my language is who cares, what is known, what's the key question, what's the key finding, and how should we interpret the key findings. Again, for reviews, the who cares and what is known are essential. So that is all that I have prepared for this particular lecture today. tomorrow, I have a few thoughts, and I really love to solicit feedback from all of you. I know that there are many articles that are in some state of needing to be published, and I think that going through these articles, applying some of the basic principles of good writing could be quite helpful if you're interested. So tomorrow, I was actually planning to take an article that I found just online, something that's already been published, and we can go through it more carefully just to illustrate again, like, what do we mean specifically by cutting the clutter, by using direct speech? And I thought that might be a nice thing to do just to kind of ease us into the editing process. If anyone is feeling brave and they'd like to volunteer their own writing for review, I would welcome that as well. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. Thanks.
You can type your questions in the chat box.
Awesome.
There's a question from Suresh Krishnan. Does scientific writing need
Yeah.
patience?
How to introduce an article. Okay. Yeah, great. These are great. I am not sure. So does the science writing need patience? I think all writing needs patience. If I'm understanding that question correctly, I think that, yeah, writing doesn't just happen all at once. It happens in a stepwise fashion. So getting your thoughts down is the first step, and trying to organize them logically, I think, should be that first step, and you shouldn't worry about the language as much. And then in the next bit, we go through to review and edit. So I think good writing comes out of revision. Most people don't just sit down and write something gorgeous. You'll write something that passes, and then you continue to go through. Yeah, as far as I think I saw a question on how to introduce an article. This is good. So I can take all of your questions and try to incorporate them into any slide deck that I prepare in the future. Yeah, so as far as introduction of article, I think that, again, that's often going to be formulaic, and typically for introductions, you're just trying to, so basically you're trying to give the reader as much information as they need to understand your science and no more. So this is something that I can try and address in more detail. I think it might be helpful to go through worked examples. These are good questions. Thank you so much for them. So one thing from Kusumita, is it useful to open with a quote by something creative? I think I would say be careful with that. I have seen it done well. I have also seen it sound like you're trying too hard. It can work, definitely, but just be careful with that. And we can also, I'll try and find examples of what I mean by articles that work versus articles that sound like they're trying too hard. How do we figure out what parts need to be elevated when we are trying to present something that appeals to be cited? I'm not sure if I understand that. What parts need to be elevated when we are trying to present something that appeals to be cited? I'm not sure what I mean by that. If there's a restatement of that question, I would be happy to try and tackle it. Can you explain again what comes and who cares? Yeah, so these are fantastic questions. Keep them coming, and I'll look through them after the end of the meeting. But the who cares is essentially a rationale. So I'm trying to, I think having examples would be useful right now. But you know, for instance, say that we're looking at drugs for the treatment of breast cancer, right? Like, people are still dying from breast cancer or a disease. And so if you were, say, a pharmaceutical company trying to develop some new drug, the reason why you would be writing an article is that, you know, while there are treatments for breast cancer, or so breast cancer is a disease that has like X percentage rate of remission. And so that's your who cares. That's the rationale, that you have a really, really general problem statement. And then your reason for conducting research is that, you know, say many of the drugs on the market have intolerable side effects or limited efficacy or whatever, something like that. So I think you could actually imagine a research article having a physical shape. So it's like an inverted triangle. You're going to start off very, very broad, and then you kind of narrow down to a specific point. And that point, in many but not all cases, that point can be the key question that you're getting to, why, what it is specifically that you want to know about the world. In the case of a review, you're going to start very, very broad, and again, narrow down to, are you writing this review to talk about safety? Are you writing this review to talk about the way that this drug functions in maybe women versus men, or whatever. Okay. Let's see. Familiar with key rules, use passive voice. Is it acceptable to use active voice? It's always acceptable to use active voice. So active voice is typically going to be more direct. It's typically going to be more clear. And then past tense, yeah, so past tense is definitely acceptable. If you're writing about something that was done, I would say in general, I favor present tense, but the most important thing is to pick one tense and then stick with it within a section. Present tense is often going to be favored when you're writing up results. So, right, let's see. How can we decide on the construction of our paper if our target population of readers is from beginners to expert? That's a fantastic question. Yeah, that's a really, really fantastic question. So yeah, I think, right, okay, it's like teaching. For instance, like if you imagine yourself as a teacher in a classroom, there are always going to be students that maybe they came from a more difficult background and they don't know as much as some of your students who are top of the class, right? And so I think that, like, if you're thinking from beginners to experts, try and figure out where the middle is for what you're particularly writing. I think in general, experts want things explained to them, or they want to be reminded of things in a way that's really, really clear. So I had the privilege of seeing Roderick McKinnon give a talk. Roderick McKinnon won the Nobel Prize for discovering the crystal structure of one of the very first ion channels. And what really struck me when he gave this talk is that he went up to the lectern and he drew like a cartoon of a cell membrane. And in the most simple language, he just explained how ions pass through these channels. He was not trying to conceal anything. He used clear, direct speech. And I think what was so memorable about that to me is that he was a Nobel laureate. I mean, if there's ever an expert, it would be him. And he felt absolutely no need to talk in a way that was overly abstract. He just started at the start. And I think that really an intelligent high school student probably would have been able to understand what he was talking about. So I think you kind of have to toggle it. You have to figure out when you need to be more detailed and when you can zoom out some. But I think maybe your audience should be upperclassmen in college. That's actually a pretty decent place to start when you're writing science papers. It's not a hard and fast rule though. References to include in scientific writing. Yeah, so anything that you cite, it's something that you want to reference always. Yeah, so in general, you want to take things and put them into your own words. So again, find your own voice. But if you're citing anything, if an idea isn't typically general knowledge, if you're referencing someone's paper, then yeah, cite them. And then I have this question. Sometime while writing, we need to repeat the same word again and again. Don't we need to find synonyms then? I think that, yeah, I get what you're saying, that like having variety in word choice is definitely a good thing. I think as a first draft though, don't worry about that. So as a first draft, I think the most important thing is to be as clear as you possibly can be, to get words down on the page logically and clearly. And if that means repeating the same word over and over again, that's okay, so long as your message is clear. So typically, you'll have to, think more about kind of the more advanced style and refined style during your revision. But as a first pass, whenever you're writing something, don't worry so much about, does this sound beautiful? It's almost certainly not going to sound beautiful. And that's true even if you're a fantastic writer. The goal is to just get your thoughts down in a way that's organized, clear, and logical. Okay, which is more catchy? Introducing article's topic with a question and then follow up with an answer, or directly give the information? Hello? Did anyone? Oh, okay, I think we're fine. So for this question, I would say, don't worry about being catchy. Initially, I think that catchiness is something that can probably best be left to advertising agencies. I think for science papers, what is catchy is what is the most clear. So it would again depend on what exactly you're writing and figuring out based on that topic, what is the clearest way that you can explain something. Okay. How to avoid plagiarism? Okay, this is a fantastic question. How to avoid plagiarism while writing? Yeah, I don't know if all of you, I know that there was a talk planned on plagiarism. I don't know if you've had it or if you're going to have it, but it's definitely something worth repeating and talking about. Yeah, so that's a really, really fantastic question. And I'm very, very glad that someone asked that. Yeah, so I think trying to just be careful. The best way to guard against plagiarism is to write something in your own voice. And that's probably why that I chose to make that rule the first one. And I think that, again, so I'll give you a concrete example. Avoiding plagiarism can be hard if you don't know your subject well. So as a postdoc, I did a postdoc at UCSF, and I was partly mentored by a computational neuroscientist. So my background is in neurobiology, basic cell molecular biology, and wet lab work. And so I had to write a grant that discussed some of these techniques that I was going to be using from computational neuroscience. And I wasn't as familiar with that as I was a lot of wet lab techniques and bench techniques. And so I found that very, very hard. I think that, again, I mentioned this, if you are struggling to kind of say things in your own words, that is often a good sign that you might need to think harder about the concept. So there's different ways to avoid plagiarism. The first is something that I do is I'll read a sentence and I will just try and say out loud that sentence in a different way using different words. You can play a few games with yourself. So you could imagine, okay, if I had to explain that sentence to my grandmother, how would I phrase that? If I had to explain the meaning of that sentence to a 12-year-old, how would I say that? The other trick is in the slide where I mentioned Erasmus, the philosopher from the 14th, 15th century, sorry, 15th, 16th century. He would try and like take a single sentence and say it in as many different ways as he could think of. So that's another tool that you can use, of just taking a sentence and maybe not worrying so much about saying the sentence in a way that's beautiful, but saying the sentence in a way that is your way, in a way that is novel. If you can do that, then again, when you go back or when your colleagues go back to edit it, they can improve the language. And I think something to keep in mind is that most of the improvement in language comes during revision. So again, goals during the first pass of writing is to be logical, to be clear, and don't plagiarize. So thank you for that question. Suggestions for non-native English speakers. Yeah, non-native English speakers are heroes. All of you who are non-native English speakers are amazing for being able to tackle writing in not your first language. I think that probably the best advice for non-native English speakers that is general is to just focus on being clear. I actually love working with non-native English speakers just because I think that if the ideas are clear and logical, clear language can come from that. And sometimes buddying up with someone who is a native speaker is all that it would take to go from a clear, logical, maybe imperfectly worded article to a really, really strong piece. Okay, results should be in past or present tense. I tend to favor present tense. This isn't a hard and fast rule. The most important thing though is if you stay in the same tense. So if you want to write in present tense, write in present tense. If you want to write in past tense, write in past tense. Okay, from Kruthi, what if there are fewer references for a paper than required, but the statement is novel? I'm so sorry, I'm not sure if I understand that question. If you rephrase it, I might be able to tackle it. Okay, do you think a scientific article should include our opinions? Absolutely, but your opinions belong in the discussion section. So in the introduction, your goal is to do a little bit of a literature review and to give the reader all the information he or she needs to understand what you wrote, the experiments that you conducted, and no more. Once you get to the discussion, absolutely opinions are totally appropriate in a discussion section. Okay, so from Angad, even if we change the phrase or sentence, it still shows some percentage of plagiarism. How do we overcome that? That's something, yeah, I think I know what you mean. I think I know what you mean with this. I think that working with examples would be helpful here. I think that, yeah, I want to hold off on answering that question until we have some concrete examples. But I also, I really, really do appreciate this question because I think it shows kind of concern for not plagiarizing, and it's a great question for that. I will try and find examples, and that way it'll be more clear of what we mean by plagiarism and what would not be plagiarism. For a good paper, how many references do we need? That totally depends on the paper. I don't think there is a single answer that I can give for that. Can I get a recorded file? Hopefully I recorded this. If I did not, I apologize, but I will be leading more discussions and I'll make sure to record if I didn't this time. Okay. In case of the target populations, making the paper lengthy, how to avoid that? In case when the target population is beginners to expert, we run a risk of making the paper lengthy. Yep, how to avoid that? I think, so again, this gets to writing versus editing. If you write in a way that is maybe you give too much information, that's actually a lot easier to deal with as an editor than not writing enough. So I think that I tend to write in a way that's pretty compact, and sometimes I need to force myself to write longer. If you write in a style that is maybe too much information, that is way, way easier to edit. So I think again, as your first pass as a writer, if you're writing maybe more information than is strictly necessary, that's totally cool. That's totally cool. In the process of revision and editing, you or a colleague or someone will go back through the paper, and often many things can be cut and condensed. But as a first pass, a lengthy paper is fine. Okay, good plagiarism tools. A lot of you have asked about plagiarism, which I think is fantastic. I will look into this more carefully to try and get more resources. I don't have them right now, but this is something that I will absolutely investigate. Okay. Oh, thank you. After Sarah's done, thank you. Okay, great. Is it a good idea to write a paper that has a fair amount of humor and also is more likely to talk to the reader instead of following a tight structure? It depends on what you're writing. So I can think of an example of a perspective that was written by Chris Miller. He's another ion channel physiologist. This guy is like an amazing writer, and he can be quite funny. But I think as a good rule of thumb, don't try humor right off the bat. So I would say it's better to err on the side of dry and boring when you're writing science. Obviously, this is not true for other types of writing, but humor is something that you want to be really careful with, just because what you find funny or what I find funny isn't necessarily going to transfer to everyone. And again, the main goal of a science paper is to just be clear. But I also understand the desire to make things catchier to get people's attention. But I would argue that clear, logical, well-researched writing is enough. It stands on its own. That's what makes a scientific paper compelling. Okay, it's another question on plagiarism, so I think people will turn to that. Problem statement is novel, yet there is no proper prior work on that. How do we tackle references if we are about to write a paper on that particular? I see. So if the problem statement is novel, I think again, you want to find, so yeah, I think I understand that question now. So if what you're trying to accomplish is novel, there's still going to be a lot of information that is known. So I think a question to ask yourself is, where did this problem statement come from? Like, so what was the information, what was the knowledge that led up to this problem statement? So a problem statement can often be reworded as a question, right? And so if you think, what is it that someone would need to know to have thought of that question, is a good place to start to gather information on, okay, what was known previously. Like the question or problem statement doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It happens because there's knowledge about the world, there's knowledge about a particular topic, and a question is born from that. So that would be a place to start looking for articles to cite. Okay, from Samir, is it a good idea to write mini papers focusing on specific portions as part of a broader topic, or one paper having it all? Totally depends on the type of paper that you're going to write. You know, I could probably make a case for either. I think that writing papers on more specific topics are easier to write. They just become less daunting. But I know a lot of papers that I see in like the annual reviews, so there's like annual review of neuroscience, they have like 300 citations. They're crazy. So sometimes writing a massive review article is appropriate. But I think focusing on smaller portions typically can be a lot easier. And the other thing is that even if you do have to write a gigantic article on a really, really broad topic, I think thinking about that paper as a collection of small papers will make it more manageable. It's just less overwhelming if you think small initially. Yes. How to deal with writer's block. You know the subject very well, but can't put it into proper flow. Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you what I do is I have a large glass of wine, and then I set a timer for say 5 minutes. And I force myself to just type down everything I can in 5 minutes. And I put no restrictions on myself. So if the words that come out of my mouth are terrible, I don't care. I just force myself to write on a page for 5 minutes. Another trick that I use is writing with a pencil and paper. Sometimes I find that that's easier to do if I have a pencil and paper in my hand. I guess it's just sort of switching things up a little bit. You're not looking at a blank computer screen. Another trick that I use is talking out loud. So imagining that I did theater in high school, and so I think this is why I rely on talking out loud a lot. So imagine that you're trying to explain what you have to write about. You're explaining it to a room of high school students or middle school students or your parents, whoever you want to put there. And I think sometimes thinking of like the younger kids can be really, really helpful. So just imagine that you're explaining that to like a younger sibling, a niece, nephew, whomever, and you're trying to get them to understand a topic. And so that can help just by sort of speaking the words aloud. That can help show you what you're good on, what you might not be as good on, and it starts getting you to sort of think in sentences, which is always helpful. How to avoid grammatical errors in a paper. Grammatical errors happen. Again, case-by-case basis. Typically, grammatical errors are something that we all will deal with during revisions and edits, and we'll talk about that more. Keeping questions about abstract. Overall questions are good, but there will be other seasons too. Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, cool. I think this might be a good stopping point for me. It's 9:49, so if anybody has like additional questions, that's fine. I don't want to steal everyone's time, and I know that there's another presentation, and I also realize a lot of you are on the other side of the world, and it's getting quite late. So I'm happy to stop here, but I'll be in constant contact with Secant, just trying to develop content for you that could be helpful and help with all of your writing. So I don't have anything further. If somebody else wants to take over, I can stop sharing my screen now, I suppose.
Yeah, so Sarah,
Okay.
amazing presentation. This is very useful. Thank you very much.